This lecture is about testing your ideas. So now we're moving towards the end of the design thinking process. We've worked our way through defining the problem, designing solutions, prototyping, and now it's time to test those prototypes. Now, I don't know how you all are feeling at this point, but usually by the time I've gotten to the prototype phase, I'm tired and I've been percolating and I've learned a lot and I'm feeling like the hard part is over, and yet the most important part has yet to come, which is really putting our prototypes in front of users and in front of people to give us feedback. And sometimes this is the hardest part because we've become attached to our work. Maybe we're running short on time. It's a humbling part to put your ideas in front of people. I know, for example, when I sometimes write a paper or do work, I am in that zone and I think it's amazing. And I'm like, this is the best idea ever. And I send it off and then it comes back marked up with red, right? We've all been through that. And there's a little bit of that quality to this work, but if we step back from a beginner's mind and remember that this is part of our time-saving process, that this is part of how we, fail faster, succeed sooner, we can find testing to be an invaluable part of our work. So really, again, testing is all about extracting the full value. It's not just enough to design the prototype for ourselves, but it's important to understand how our prototype is being received by others. So above all, the people we want to get in front of is, of course, our users. We want to understand how the people who are actually going to use the intervention in the field think about that project, think about the prototype, and what do they tell us about the project. Obviously, in a few cases, we haven't been able to get to our user, and in those cases, you really need to just find the next best input that you possibly can, people that are very familiar with the users, people that are experts about the problem. But there's another piece to this, right? As social workers, we are part of rich systems and communities, and users may not be the only people whose feedback we think about. We should prioritize it, certainly, but experts can be invaluable in giving us feedback about our prototypes. Not only those experts with whom we talked about the problem, and by the way, those are people that if you had a good conversation with them, go back to them, say, you know what, I've done my prototype now, what do you think? Does this solve your problem? What insights do you have for me? The other experts that are really important to get in front of are the experts that understand the clinical approaches or the technology that you want to use. These are people who may be able to give you very specific feedback about implementation and how the technology should integrate and whether or not you've thought through the system correctly or not. Usually their feedback's a little bit better later stage, but it certainly is worthwhile soliciting that advice and making sure that you're including it, as you move through and work through prototypes, and certainly as you work through design cycles. Now, of course, we also take into account our stakeholders, our gatekeepers, and our beneficiaries. Our stakeholders and gatekeepers may know important things for us about feasibility, about whether or not our project will scale, or how we ultimately deliver our project. The other important piece is to make sure we include our beneficiaries, our clients. Even if we've decided that they're not necessarily the user, it's important to understand what they think and to include them in the design process. It's part of the real ethos of inclusiveness of social work. For far too often in history, beneficiaries haven't been included, and people have designed interventions to help them without actually asking them what will help them. So it's important to incorporate the opinions of all these people at various points. Lastly, there's an informal source of advice and guidance that we can get, or I guess it's also formal. These are obviously our colleagues, our classmates, our professors, and of course our friends and family. Now, professors may be a little bit more formal, but the rest kind of are part of this informal information gathering that we do. And I really think it can be super helpful to put your ideas in front of people, practice walking through them, practice explaining, seeing what questions they have. Oftentimes friends and family are the unsung heroes of our work because they're the ones that are, with us in the dark hours, grinding it out. So I strongly encourage you to take all of this advice and feedback that you get into account. And we'll talk about some ways to balance it if it ever feels like too much. But you may hear, in the design thinking kind of framework, user, 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 and that is true. But I think in social work, it's fair to say we also need to think about what these other people have to tell us. So we're going to talk about a couple specific types of feedback sessions. First off, you can have one-on-one conversations with either users or other people that you've, experts or any of the people really from that list. And again, these will really follow kind of the interview format that we've practiced already, because our goal is to try to not put ourselves too much into it or try to solicit the responses we want. We really want to try to solicit what we need to hear and to try to be somewhat neutral and inquisitive and curious about what they have to say about it, and trying to not be too protective or too defensive about our ideas. So one-on-one conversations, you can absolutely leverage those skills, and certainly we'll talk about it, but our friends who wrote Designing for Growth, like an Ogilvy, definitely think that these one-on-one conversations can really be the gold standard, because you're getting people's clear feedback without other sources mixed in. Now we'll talk about the pros and cons of that. We also, obviously in this course, are going to use design labs. You're producing them as one of your assignments. You're going to see how they work in class, and I even hope that you exercise some of the techniques outside of class. Now there's a whole lecture dedicated to design labs, so I'm not really going to talk any more about them here, but some of the things that you learn here will definitely apply. So don't be afraid to cross-pollinate a little bit about what you learn, and certainly come back to your professor with any questions. What we are going to talk about in the remainder of this lecture are focus groups and customer co-creation. So let's dive into each one in turn. So focus groups, I kind of think of the Mad Men model of a moderator in a room with a bunch of people asking questions, asking them to talk about or respond to a product or ad. In this case, the thing that they will likely be responding to is your prototype. And again, for these focus groups, you want to strive for users, but you may find that mixed focus groups are useful. And certainly one of the prevailing pieces of guidance is to make sure that you're thinking about a diverse makeup of your users, both in terms of demographics and competencies. We can't obviously hear from everybody, but as much as we can approximate who we want to hear from and try to make sure that as many, that we're being as inclusive as possible and as many voices as possible are heard, that's really helpful. It can be a guided or open discussion. And in addition to sort of answering questions about a product, it can cover perceptions, options, beliefs, and attitudes. So a couple of tips for running a focus group. Shoot for 5 to 10 users. And I think honestly 10's a little on the unwieldy side. I think 5 to 7 max, especially if you're a novice focus group runner, would be my guidance to you. You want to plan ahead or create a script. And by that we mean really select questions carefully. Again, like our interviews, you want to consider the flow and interconnection. You want to be careful not to defend, but it is okay and sometimes essential to ask follow-ups for understanding when it's needed. So if you think someone's on the edge of telling you something really insightful or really important, ask that follow-up question for clarity. You want to moderate the question with an eye towards neutrality and inclusiveness, again, much like our interviews. And you want to consider all of the comforts of a meeting, making sure that you potentially do an icebreaker to warm everybody up, that everyone has name tags, that you potentially follow up or, give them breaks, make sure that they're, treated well, have snacks, whatever the things are that'll make it a nice experience for them to participate in. And lastly, this may not always be feasible, when we're students working on projects, but if possible, you might want to just be an observer. So you might want to have an independent moderator or even a trained moderator, and maybe some assistant note takers who are helping you through the process, so that you can really listen and think about what's being said. Now let's turn to customer co-creation. The absolute most important part of this process is really inviting the users or contributors to be part of and invested in the development. And you can see how this is just very aligned with the design thinking ethos and methodology, right? It's about inclusiveness and really going to the source about what they need and how they can best be helped. And really, in truth, the spirit of this activity can be applied to any format. But customer co-creation sessions are working sessions that sometimes can employ some of the techniques of a design lab, but they aren't necessarily quite so structured. They're more about putting a prototype in front of the group or the interviewee and asking them to give you feedback. Now, in my experience, you can also do a couple other approaches. One is what I would call a tabula rasa, which is a blank slate approach. So you can ask people to help you co-create, tell you what they need, scope, design from a blank slate. You don't have to necessarily have a response in the prototype, but it is important to know that if you have a prototype, you should absolutely get their feedback. The other way to think about it is a straw man, and these are what kind of prototypes, but they're often created imperfectly, flawed, a little bit quickly with the idea that they will be defeated. So it may be purposefully a little bit wrong in order to get people to make it right and to help us have that insight. So straw men can be another way to go in either customer co-creation or design sessions. But ultimately, for this purpose and this part of the process and how we're going to do it, you're hopefully going to bring your prototype in front of people for feedback. So just to keep in mind, again, as you go through this process, in the long run, it de-risks and reduces costs. So there is a payoff for your work. So a couple steps for customer co-creation, and this comes almost exclusively out of the Ogilvy and Leica Designing for Growth, a design thinking toolkit for managers. So this is primarily their stuff. There's a couple asterisks where I'm going to share my own opinion with you about how to do it, but I just want to make sure you know where to go back to the source, and the writing on this starts on 159 if you have the book. So first off, you want to enroll customers, users, and they suggest who care about you. I think it's good to have people who care. I may be less attached to them, caring about you specifically, but you do want to make sure that you include people who you think will be able to contribute in a positive way to your project, or be able to participate. I've definitely had convenings where the mix wasn't right, or where certain people overpowered or threw off the balance of a room, and it can be very destructive to a process. So in these sessions, they're obviously suggesting they be exclusively users, but I think it's okay to have different people in customer co-creation sessions, like a user, a stakeholder, and an expert, and have them all working together. I think you can get some really powerful and exciting feedback that way. That's also why I'm not so sold on the engaging one user at a time piece. But ultimately, what you do want to do is just make sure that those other personalities or types don't overpower the group. Because sometimes you put an expert in the room, especially if they're like a formal academic or have a higher level of education, and that can intimidate people. So sometimes a way to get around that is use first names and just do other things to make sure that everyone feels like they're on an equal playing field. Again, one of the things that that the Designing for Growth authors emphasize is that diversity equals security. And what they mean by that is having a diverse group of users and participants helps you make sure that you're hearing from as many voices as possible. And it protects you from getting blindsided by needs and opinions that you weren't expecting or hadn't heard. So inclusiveness really makes sure that we're considering all the different perspectives and make sure that we're really raising the challenges or concerns now. They advise to make it a no selling zone. So what they mean is they don't want you to spend all the time pitching your idea. They really want your customers, your users to do 80% of the talking. So that's the 80% rule. So try as much as possible, again, to step back, be in that listening, learning mindset, and try to make sure that you're creating a space for them to really talk and share. And we'll again talk about some techniques that can help with that. Like in Ogilvy suggests engaging with one user at a time. Again, I think this can be really valuable for the reasons that they outline, which is that you're really getting someone sort of untainted, unbiased, unpushed feedback, and that it can be very useful and you can have that direct dialogue. I think that can be really powerful. And they also suggest putting in front of that person 2 or 3 choices, and even including choices that you don't think they're select, like they might be too extreme or too tame. And seeing what happens, and you might be really surprised. So you might want to sort of nest your prototype in other ideas or other iterations to see ultimately what they select and what they tell you. They said provide visual stimulus, but leave it rough. And what they mean by that is give them that visual prototype to react to, but it shouldn't be perfect, and you might not even want to put it on glossy paper. You want to almost make it feel like it is something that can be iterated and tweaked. If you offer them something too perfect, they're not going to want to break it for you. So make sure it feels like something that they are comfortable rolling up their sleeves and working with you on. You might want to also provide the tools to help customers communicate visually. And we'll talk about what a couple of those can be, but it's things that help them do storyboarding or sketching. It's all of the tools of our trade, our Post-its, our Sharpies, our sticky dots, or using the virtual equivalent platforms like Mural. All of this can help make it easier for the customers to communicate and share the ideas, especially without you inadvertently pushing them in certain directions. Lastly, make sure you leave time for discussion to get their feedback and really hear from them and engage. And make sure you involve them in what the outcomes are. So provide them timely feedback, tell them how you used it, thank them for their work, all of the best practices of thanking people for their time, because it's hugely valuable, and we're so lucky to get that input. It really saves us so much in the long run. So all of these are elements that can make customer co-creation more successful. So a couple tools that like an Ogilvy offer in their Designing for Growth field book, a step-by-step project guide. The tools that they offer are storyboards, which you'll be practicing in class, cartoons and bubbles, so kind of the same features of storyboards are making kind of comics, and having little dialogue circles can make it kind of a fun, engaging way to get their thoughts. They have information in their book on page 82 about card sorts and mock-ups. There's also plenty of information in various design resources from IDEO and those type of groups. And we may even want to do certain kind of prototyping exercises like cognitive walkthroughs or 3D mock-ups, and asking them to share and verbalize their opinion. Now, one thing to note back to just our important ethical considerations. For the most part, most of the prototypes that we put in front of an audience and ask what they think will be perfectly clear as a part of our classwork, they won't be considered research. At a certain point though, if you put a 3D mock-up in front of somebody and it involves either new clinical approaches that have not been previously tested or researched, or if it includes new technology that hasn't been tested for safety, these are things that could really trigger you needing more protections and having gone through things like IRBs and regulatory approval. So these kinds of prototype direct engagements may not be things that you want to work through with people at this stage. And I don't anticipate that most of your prototypes yet for this course will be at that phase. But if you have any concerns about whether or not it's safe or it's proving efficacy, please see your faculty instructor as soon as possible about that, so we make sure that you're testing your ideas in an ethically and professionally appropriate manner. So one thing I wanted to leave you with is with some tips for managing information overload. And this is something that will serve you in this program. You're going to get lots of advice, and some of it may be conflicting from different professors, from different advisors. And again, I always encourage students to stay anchored in their role as the director and leader and visionary of this innovation. But there are some things that we can do to make it easier and more manageable for us to process. The first part is, of course, always feel free to step back, take a break, and above all, give yourself time to percolate. You might come out of a session going, holy moly, they just broke everything. Now I feel like I have to start over. What do I do? That's normal, and that happens. And give yourself some time to process. Oftentimes we sleep on it, we think about it, we talk about it, we take a break and come back to it. And we have that breakthrough, or we have a way of seeing how we can fix it that can really work for us. So I strongly encourage you to do that if that's, if you're hitting that overload point. Definitely try to invoke the right mindsets that will help you better tolerate information. And this can be like the beginner's mindset, the abundance mindset, any of these things that can, our growth mindset, anything that helps us really reframe so that we're, in that learning mode, where we're remembering that, it is okay, that this ultimately is of value to us to do this work. That can really help you be more sort of tolerant to feedback. Consider their biases or point of view. If you think that something they're saying is off, or you don't really understand where it's coming from, take the time to step back and investigate. One of the freedoms that we have in this design process is to evaluate the source and assess where are they coming from and how is their impact informing me. While we want to listen to everybody, you may find that certain sources are ultimately more reliable or more helpful, and that's okay. So make sure that you're just thinking about where people are coming from as you try to put their feedback into context. Kind of following up the step back and take a break part, don't try to fix everything at once or right away. Give yourself time to see what the path forward may be. Just take time to think it through and in kind of one bite at a time. That'll help us, from getting overwhelmed and panicking too much. One way to do this and manage this, especially if you feel like it's sort of, again, information overload, is translating the feedback into things that you've learned or need to explore further. So it might help you to really distill your feedback down into written findings, things that are actionable, things that maybe aren't actionable, what can be fixed, what can't be fixed. maybe some, if-then statements, whatever helps you sort of process and make sense of what the information that you learned means for you and impacts your work in your direction. As I kind of alluded to, you don't have to take one person's word for it. So if you think feedback that someone's given you, was surprising, or you want another perspective, go out and seek that perspective. Ask multiple users, get more advice. Sometimes we're lucky in that a lot of people tell us the same thing over and over again, but you might end up with talking to 10 people and having it split 5-5. And so you may want to go to those key tiebreakers. You may want to keep investigating when you don't have that kind of clear guidance. And even sometimes you do, maybe you need to go back and push on it. And to this end, I would also advise, don't discount your compass. With truly innovative visions, some people may not see it. They're in the system. They're, in some ways, they're a part of the problem. And so a lot of the truly groundbreaking ideas may not really resonate. So just one example from my life is I worked for Fox Studios when they were creating Hulu.com. And they started off with this website called New Site. And then they had a list of names, and they, according to these rules that they felt like applied about names, they thought that the one available name that they wanted to buy was Hulu. And I thought it was truly not a good name. I thought no one will like it. It didn't make sense to me. And of course, now everyone's totally comfortable saying it and pays them lots of money for television. So sometimes if we're in it, we may not see what that innovative step was. And in fact, it was a pretty innovative decision, because they were doing it based on how we spell, how we type, how we interact with the internet, and making sure that their product was really differentiated. So it was quite a smart business decision to go that route. So, I'm using myself as an example of the not seeing it, but at the same time, you may be the person that has that insight. You've been thinking about this problem. You will be thinking about this problem a lot, and you're going to learn a lot. So trust your instincts. And if you think you have something really bold, follow your vision, push the envelope. Now, again, just hang on to, as you're managing information overload, that the goal is to fail our ideas. So think of all the money and time you save in the long run. And worst case, just come back to that. Think about this learning is helping you speed up and accelerate overall. One other tip on this I have is gamify. So think about trying to make this a game. How can I make all of the puzzle pieces fit? Put them all out and see how does it all come together, and see if you can come up with something that integrates everything that you've learned, or again, go back to the drawing board and intentionally challenge yourself to design a bunch of new designs that accommodate the learnings. So the last tip I have for you is create a kitchen cabinet. This is a group of trusted advisors, people that are your informal sounding board. They can be your best friends, they can be mentors, they can be professors that you respect, whoever it is that you think kind of potentially gets the project, or they can even be experts that you've hit it off with. And keep them, kind of close at hand. Keep them, on speed dial on the phone, and pick it up and ask them when you run into challenges or get feedback that you're not sure what to make sense of. Oftentimes, those conversations at that moment can be super valuable and really help you have those breakthroughs. So lastly, I just wanted to remind you all that there is a little nugget in the final assignment about this. So some of the questions you have to answer in your final presentations for the course are, what is your prototype? How did you develop it? But then ultimately, how have you tested your ideas and integrated feedback? And you'll note that the 7 points are from the design lab, which you'll obviously do in class. But I am challenging you to ask how are you incorporating feedback from users or other stakeholders? And I assure you that all the faculty will be looking for and rewarding those students that do the extra legwork. You have 5 weeks at the end of this class where students are running design labs, and where a majority of the work has been submitted. So that should be a great time for you to do some learning sessions, run some co-creation sessions out there for yourselves with your users and stakeholders and experts and all the people that you think can really help you make your innovation and your project a lot better. So good luck on the final assignment. Good luck on doing this kind of testing work. It's so valuable, and it's where I think you're going to finally see the payoff of your design thinking process. So again, don't hesitate to let your professors know if you have any questions or want any help with this. But I'm excited to see for all of you how your design labs go and how the testing process works. So definitely share your stories. Thanks so much. Have a good night.